So we are doubtless in the same situation. Only we have a kind of blinkers on whereby we only see half the picture. We get the end of it, that it can push us around, but we don't get the other end. That being pushed around is what we asked for. We evoke it all by the very fact that we're here. Children don't think that they are responsible for being born. They blame their parents, not realizing they can't really separate themselves from their parents' patterns. For example, in the measure that I have sexual desires, I can understand my father's predicament. I couldn't possibly blame him because actually, I was the evil gleam in his eye when he approached my mother. I asked for it. Now, you can see in this that your relationship to the world, as being responsible for everything that happens to you, is not the same as an ordinary boss, who would be a magician, saying all sorts of improbable things should happen. Rather, it is this: if you think of yourself only as the consciousness, then, if you get some ideas from me about being in control of everything that happens to you, you will act stupidly, as if you were the boss of the whole thing, like a lunatic thinking he's God. But, if, on the other hand, you understand that your real self is the wisdom expressed in the intelligent form of your organism, then you won't fall into the error of thinking your relationship to the world is that of its governor. This morning, I want to talk about space in relation to what is ordinarily called reincarnation, because this is one of the most fascinating applications of the sense that space constitutes something significant. Now, the subject of reincarnation is one surrounded by an incredible amount of hocus pocus. Yet, there is something in it, not mainly because of the alleged evidence in stories of children remembering their former lives and so on. Instead, I want to approach the subject much like Erwin Schrödinger, the physicist, does. He has a view of reincarnation that involves no hocus pocus at all. It is perfectly simple, and all the evidence for it is already before us. This idea involves no claim to special insight or psychic knowledge, but instead simply requires grasping a principle staring us in the face. The principle isn't difficult to understand because of its inherent complexity, it's just unfamiliar. Between stars, there is darkness. Between stars, there is not the energy that constitutes a so-called body. In some modern physical theory, though purely hypothetical, not fully tested bodies in space are thought of as points where space is intensified. But, at any rate, there are these gaps, these intervals. Obviously, the unconscious state must appear, always, to the conscious state as a gap or interval. So, when we go to sleep at night, we wake up in the morning almost instantly. In other words, nothing seems to have happened except something vague between going to sleep and waking, unless you had dreams. And so, you can barely conceive of going to sleep but not waking up, or, the reverse, waking up without having ever gone to sleep. This is the nearest we can imagine to death and birth, respectively. To go to sleep and never wake up, that's what we call death. To wake up but not remember ever having gone to sleep, that's birth. This bugs our imagination because it's inconceivable in terms of consciousness. So then, what might appear as lines of continuity between the various lives could be said to be there in the sense that there are veins and nerve lines embedded in the cell structure of muscles. But always, it's quite clear to us, there is something about the projections we make of faces into marble that has a kind of illusion to it. Quite so. And what Buddhist philosophy wants to draw our attention to is that the same kind of illusion exists in our attitude to the physical world. We are projecting. But, of course, creatures of like structure will make the same projections, just as we look around here and see that we are more or less all the same basic shape, and therefore probably have the same sort of brains inside our heads. We are projecting a more or less similar structure upon the external world, and our agreement about that is the same as saying, well, that's the way it is. But you see how relative that is. It is in relation to having a brain system of this particular kind. So, the Westerner may be anxious that his idea about reincarnation is something more than a fantasy. The Oriental, the Buddhist, or the Hindu very much hopes it is only a fantasy. In that case, it can be overcome. He can be delivered from a cycle of futility. Only, you mustn't understand, again, you must understand that too literally. If you want to know what Buddhists really teach on this matter, put it in a very simple way. Get a book by Alexander David Neal called The Secret Oral Teachings. Difficult to get hold of, but somebody in this country is going to publish it soon. It's published in India, but I think Lawrence Ferlinghetti is going to publish it, City Lights, San Francisco. That book really goes into this. I call it the I Told You So book because I've often been accused of inventing my own unique brand of Buddhism and hoisting it off on the public as being the real thing. I just have to point them to this book and say, you see, Alexandre David Neil, that's French. David Neil. You could say David Neil. So now what becomes interesting in this is, how will you pick out the lines of continuity between lives? Why, just in the same way as you pick out continuity between tones, by the way they interval to each other. In which case, the death interval, the off interval, becomes the significant connecting factor between the on intervals. That's what you do when you look at patterns of blobs on a wall. You could play with Roland Hall's paintings that way and see all sorts of things in them. It depends on what intervals you find significant that connect what you call the on pieces. See, you've always got off pieces and on pieces. You've got a kind of mosaic. Look into a press photograph with a magnifying glass, and you find a mosaic of black and white dots. And so, again, you can make the significant connections. As you do, you come out with somebody's face. And so, in the world, our nerves are very much like the press photograph. When something impinges upon the retinal backdrop of the eye, it impinges upon a whole lot of rods and cones that are either on or off. The state of a neuron, you see, is that it fires or it doesn't fire. So we've got this press photograph in it. If you work with LSD, this becomes very clear. You get a vision sometimes of the world which is positively pointillist, like the paintings of Seurat. Somehow it seems as if your nerve ends had been activated individually, and you become aware of a grainy quality in everything. This could be dismissed as a pure hallucination, but all hallucinations have some basis in our neural structure. You see, they may not be experiences of what we call the objective world, but in any experiment that turns your consciousness on your consciousness, your senses on your senses, you will get curious things happening. Just as you might get oscillations in electric circuitry. So, it would then be intervals once again that could be the significant connecting factors in a developmental pattern of an individual through a series of incarnations. But those intervals are illusions. The connection is illusory, but in a sense, it's an illusion to which we Westerners are not really accustomed. Maya means illusion in a very complex sense. It also means creative power, art, magic, calculation, in the sense of the calculus. This is difficult for us to understand. You see, the notion that the world is Maya, why is it difficult for us to understand that? What is our feeling about saying, this is a dream, a projection? If you were told that you were going to be given half an hour's interview with God, and you had the privilege of asking one question, I wonder what you would ask. You might be given some preparation too, because when you think, what is my ultimate question? You will probably go through many ideas before arriving at it. And I know many people would discover that they had no question to ask. The situation would be altogether too overwhelming. But many people to whom I've put this problem say that the question they would ask is, who am I? And that is something we know very little about. Whatever it is that we call I is too close for inspection. It's like trying to bite your own teeth or touch the tip of your finger with the tip of the same finger. Although other people can tell you who you are, and often do, they only see you from the outside, just as you see them from the outside. You don't see yourself from the inside. And so, the nature of what we call I is extremely puzzling. There's confusion about how much of us is actually I. We talk in ordinary ways about my body or my feet. When we go to the dentist to have our teeth fixed, we regard them as a mechanic, like taking your car to the garage. You take your body to the surgeon or the dentist to be fixed, to have parts changed or something of that kind. Now, that gets more complicated. When someone has a heart transplant, it feels radical because we say things like, in my heart of hearts. But nowadays, most of us feel that whatever I is, it's located in the head. Somewhere behind the eyes and between the ears, we imagine, is the center of the self. The rest of the body becomes an appendage, a vehicle that carries the self around. Popular speech reflects this sensation, that I am fundamentally different from what we call the other people, other things. Anything we become aware of feels other. There is an apparent opposition between the knower and the known. We talk about facing reality or coming into this world, as if we don't belong. As if, instead of being leaves growing out of a tree, we are birds that have alighted on bare branches. It's become common sense for most people in the 20th century to adopt the 19th century philosophy of science, which interprets the physical universe outside human bodies as a mechanical contraption. Stupid, unfeeling, and automatic, composed of geological elements, rocks, gases, and so forth. And so, we feel rather alone, left out of this vast, indifferent mechanism. In contrast to the Ptolemaic view, where we were at the center of the universe, we now find ourselves on the fringes of a minor galaxy, revolving around an unimportant star on a tiny minute ball of rock. This astronomical perspective can be overwhelming. It makes us feel not only insignificant but excluded. How do you open and close your hand? You can decide, I will now open my hand and do it, but you don't know how it's done. And yet, in a sense, you do know how it's done because you say, I know how to open my hand. But you don't know in words. You can't explain it. Still less can you explain how you see, and still less can you explain how you are conscious. How are you an ego? Well, you don't know because the springs of being conscious, of being an ego, are outside the surveillance of consciousness. They're somehow underneath. And that lets the cat out of the bag at once because you see that what I is something very, very much deeper than the superficial consciousness. What you call I, in the sense of the voluntary willing center ego, has very little to do with it. You are just a watchman on top of the mast, or a radar on a ship, scanning the environment with conscious attention, looking out for trouble or food. The real you is much too complicated to think about. Suppose when you woke up in the morning you had to switch yourself on. That is to say, by an act of conscious attention, you had to go through your brain and turn on all the synapses necessary for wakeful life. It'd take you hours. Suppose you really had to be conscious of all the details involved in walking, breathing, or the circulation of blood. You'd never get around to it. So, when we inspect the physical world with conscious attention, the first thing that strikes us is that the physical world is extraordinarily complicated. How can it possibly be organized? But actually, the physical world is not complicated at all. What is complicated is the task of trying to describe it in words or figure it out in numbers. It's analogous to the task of removing the water from the Pacific Ocean into the Atlantic with a beer mug. You can only take one mug at a time. And so, as we say in popular speech, you can only think of one thing at a time. That's not exactly true, but it reveals that conscious thought is a kind of calculus in which we understand things bit by bit. This leads to the superstition that things really are bits. Now, when you eat chicken, you have to bite it. You take it in bits. To make it easier, you order from the grocer a cut-up fryer. But you don't get cut-up fryers out of eggs. You see, although we speak of a chicken, an egg, or a body, these are not actually bits. They haven't been bitten off except for purposes of thinking. This idea is beautifully brought out in a passage from Whitehead, which I will read to you. He discusses 19th century philosophy of science, saying, all our impressions of nature are simply products of our minds. Nature gets credit which should, in truth, be reserved for ourselves. The rose for its scent, the nightingale for his song, and the sun for its radiance. The poets are entirely mistaken. They should address their lyrics to themselves and turn them into odes of self-congratulation on the excellency of the human mind. Nature is a dull affair, soundless, scentless, colorless. Merely the hurrying of material endlessly, meaninglessly. However you disguise it, this is the practical outcome of the characteristic scientific philosophy which closed even the 17th century. He continues, in the first place, we must note its astounding efficiency as a system of concepts for organizing scientific research. It is fully worthy of the genius of the century that produced it. It has held its own as the guiding principle of scientific studies ever since. It is not only reigning but is without a rival. And yet it is quite unbelievable. This conception of the universe is surely framed in terms of high abstractions, and the paradox only arises because we have mistaken our abstractions for concrete realities. This is what Whitehead calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, the attribution of our bitty way of thinking to the world we are biting. The separations between things are abstract. They are concepts. Just like lines of latitude and longitude. A Russian poet once wrote a beautiful poem about the world being like a ball carried in a net bag. But you don't trip over the equator when you cross it. Bit-ing, words, and abstract lines are useful, but they're dangerous when confused with natural events.